Flanked by guards, you are led through the secure castle. Princess Vivian and Prime Minister Gustav awaited you. The Prime Minister speaks a lot, in contrast to the silent princess. He asks you to swear to keep this matter secret. The royal scepter has been... A witness who saw the thief described him as Tommet, a known bandit. Your job is to track down Tommet and retrieve the scepter. Also, for the sake of the kingdom, this must be kept secret. Ranni whispers that he knows of this Tommet. He is well known and is based out of the old capital. You bow and leave the throne room.
So, in about a week out here in Australia and the rest of the West, Dragon's Crown Pro releases. This is a remake, or not really a remake, it's a re-release of a PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Vita game from back in 2013. Wow, does time fly. And it was a game that turned heads for a number of reasons back when it was new. I've had a chance to do a hands-on preview of sorts of the game's PlayStation 4 version. It's not really a preview, I guess, because the game's already been out for so many years now, and most people who would have been interested in it have probably played it by now. But there are probably also people that haven't had a chance to play Dragon's Crown. Maybe they missed the original release. Maybe they just didn't have PlayStation 3s and PlayStation Vitas, but they got a PlayStation 4. So this video, rather than be a preview, I'm going to talk about what it is I love about Dragon's Crown. And while I'm doing that, you can see me play through the first couple of levels of the game. This is the introductory tutorial, not tutorials, I passed the tutorial already. This is the first two dungeons after the tutorial. So they're the easiest dungeons, and they give you a sense of what the game's about, without being too spoilery in terms of the really cool stuff that you get up to later on in the game. So what I really love about Dragon's Crown, you saw in the introductory little cutscene before I started to talk, and that's the very Dungeons and Dragons nature of the game. Dragon's Crown was clearly inspired by that classic style of Dungeons and Dragons brawler that Capcom and the like released in the arcades a couple of decades ago. Games like Shadow over Mystera, and those games were quite popular, and this game, in terms of the gameplay, is quite heavily inspired by those. But more than that, there's the storytelling element to the game is also very Dungeons and Dragons like. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since I was quite young. I think I started to play it when I was about 7 or 8 or something. My parents had a copy of the basic Dungeons and Dragons box at home, and I discovered it and I started to read it, and I found myself so immersed in the fantasy and the monsters and the idea of crawling through dungeons, defeating enemies, finding treasure. All of that kind of stuff really appealed to young me, still appeals to this day. And one of the things that I really found enjoyable about Dungeons and Dragons, the pen on paper board game, whatever you want to call it, is the storytelling, the way that stories were told, because Dungeons and Dragons wasn't just a combat game. It was meant to be a storytelling facilitation kind of experience where one person would play the Dungeon Master, the other players around the table would all play heroes, and the Dungeon Master's job was to explain what the players were seeing, what the characters that they were talking to were saying, what the monsters they were fighting were like, and all of that kind of stuff. And it was structured in such a way that those bits of storytelling were meant to be quite brief and to the point in order to continue to allow the players to continue to push on and to have that great sense of agency, like they're the ones kind of controlling the story and the Dungeon Master is kind of responding to what they're doing in the world. So Dragon's Crown really takes that to heart. You saw that now 2 cutscenes in the video. Those 2 cutscenes are quite short and they're quite to the point, but they draw a picture for you. They tell you in very descriptive, very simple language what's going on, what the danger is, what the threats are, what your job is to do, and all that kind of stuff, and then gets you back into the dungeon to, again, explore and fight enemies and all of that kind of stuff, which is the point of the game. The main point of the game is it's a brawler, but for me, the thing that I found most interesting when I started to play it was actually the narrative storytelling. Funnily enough, I never expected that I was going to go into a brawler and get hooked by the way it was telling its story, but this game really does that so well, and it does it in a way that even the games that inspired it, such as Shadow over Mystara from Capcom back in the day, those games never did it quite this well. So for me, as somebody who's not a massive fan of brawlers in and of themselves, it was that narrative element that really got me going. The second thing that really drew me into Dragon's Crown was the visual aesthetic, and as you can see, just looking at the video, it is a gorgeous game. It was gorgeous on the PlayStation 3, PlayStation Vita, and to be honest, I haven't really noticed that much of a difference in the PlayStation 4. I know it's been upgraded to 4K resolution and all that kind of stuff, but the aesthetic, which is what really drew me into the game, has stayed the same, and they haven't really tweaked that, which is probably for the best, because the identity of Dragon's Crown is all about that aesthetic. The game comes from a Japanese developer, Vanillaware, and Vanillaware is well known for creating these very beautiful 2D action games. Odin Sphere was another one, and Muramasa was another one. So those are two other examples that are fairly well known out here in the West. The company is well known also for having that consistency in the art. So it's not just that they're really detailed character designs, it's not just that it's really lovely backgrounds. It's that there's a real sense of world and consistency to everything that is in this game. This is one dungeon, you'll see me go into another dungeon soon after, and while it's a completely different setting, this one being in caves and stuff, and the other one being kind of in a more sewer kind of environment, despite them being so very different, the consistency and the sense of world and the sense that each area is kind of connected to one another is quite explicit and quite enjoyable, because so many other games, they define their areas and each area is so completely different in order to give players a different thing to look at, that there isn't that same sense of consistency, and the game feels kind of a little bit slapshot as a result, put together haphazardly. This one doesn't. It feels like every part of it has been carefully considered in the context of everything else that's put into the game. And those visuals are really important for also continuing that Dungeons and Dragons appeal of the game, because not only do these dungeons look like exactly what I had imagined as a youngster playing the pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons game, this is exactly the kind of vision I had of what the worlds would look like as my characters were exploring them, or I was describing them to my players when I was playing as the Dungeon Master. But also the monsters are spot on, and roughly what you'd expect to meet if you're playing a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. And if you're playing a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, obviously you start out at a low level, and as you get higher level you fight more interesting monsters, I guess. Whereas it's exactly the same in Dragon's Crown, where you start off fighting enemies that you would expect to fight in a low level campaign in the Dungeons & Dragons game. And then as you up the level, you go into more dangerous areas, you fight more dangerous enemies, you start to get that sense of everything just kind of escalates in terms of the visual design as your character levels also escalating level. So yeah, that art is really important to Dragon's Crown. It was controversial-ish, I guess, back when the game was new on PlayStation 3 and Vita. There was criticisms about the way it depicted women and all that kind of thing, which, as you can see with the Valkyrie character that's there, she's not wearing much. And later on in the game you also go into the whole rescuing damsels in distress, and they're barely dressed, and you'll see a fairy in a moment who's wearing a skirt that kind of doesn't look like it would cover anything actually if it was in the real world. So there was that kind of criticism, and I'm not here to comment on that. I've done so in the past. I've had my own views on it. I don't think it's that bad necessarily. And it certainly fits with that 80s aesthetic that the Dungeons and Dragons books actually had. So again, it fits. It's keeping with it's keeping true to the experience that the game developers obviously felt when they were playing Dungeons and Dragons themselves as youngsters. But putting all of that aside, the company handled the controversy around the art quite poorly, in fairness, and that made it all the more unnecessarily controversial. But I think, hopefully, with the release of this, the re-release, people can look at it without that context and see it, for what it is, and hopefully the discussions around the art become a little bit more nuanced as a result. But of course, none of that would have mattered. It didn't matter how well it looked, and it didn't matter how true it stayed to what I remember from Dungeons & Dragons and storytelling, if the game didn't play particularly well. And as I said before in the video, I'm not the world's biggest fan of brawlers in the first place, so the fact that Dragon's Crown managed to keep me engaged so much that I played through it when it was new and got excited about replaying it again on the PlayStation 4 should tell you kind of how high quality this game's combat system really is, because it is really enjoyable. And yes, it's fast-paced, and yes, the game actually knows how to be incredibly difficult. You would have seen in the video before me really struggling with the first boss, and that's in the context of somebody who's already played the game and knows what they were doing, knows what the boss fight was about, and still managed to get myself stuck. Though in my defense, it has been 5 years since I last played the game. But point is, the game knows how to be difficult, and it's fast-paced, and it's furious, and it's everything that I don't usually like in my RPGs or my games, my fantasy games. I prefer a more kind of slow-paced and tactical experience. But this game really does everything it sets out to do so well and so elegantly, and it still manages to hold a lot of that appeal of the Dungeons & Dragons experience as well. There is still the need to use tactics because the monsters and the enemies have all different weaknesses and strengths, and you need to know how to defeat each one of them. And it's still got the loot grind, which is enjoyable, and it feels good as you power up. You find the earlier levels much easier to complete, and there's still incentives to go back and fight through and fight against weaker enemies. There is a sense of non-linearity about it, because most brawlers are obviously straight left to straight right, fight everything, kill the boss, move on. But this game, again, in that keeping with that Dungeons & Dragons tradition, it has secrets to find, it has chests, it has doors that you can unlock, and those doors will lead to secondary areas. They're an alternative path through a lot of the dungeons as well, and all of that comes together to create that sense of exploration, which is so important to the Dungeons & Dragons experience as well. So if you're kind of getting a theme here, it seems like, again, the gameplay really reinforces that Dungeons & Dragons experience, making this probably the best Dungeons & Dragons game that we've seen since Baldur's Gate way back in the 90s, and that was a very traditional RPG. This is one of those attempts to do the franchise justice in an action context, and that really hasn't been done particularly well in the past. Here's another little cutscene, this time with a really cute mouse. And that's another important thing about the game and the gameplay and all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't take itself too seriously either. Dungeons & Dragons can become very grim very quickly because it is a very kind of dark fantasy. It encourages dark fantasy play, and it encourages horrific monsters and gritty settings, and lots of downtrodden people getting squashed, and while you're playing the heroes and all that kind of stuff, it's quite easy for the game to have to get that Lord of the Rings or Dragon's Age kind of atmosphere about it, whereas Dragon's Crown still has that sense of humour, still has that sense of entertainment, still you still have a good time with it, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, which is really important, because otherwise it would get very frustrating. Like I said, the game knows how to be difficult, and it doesn't apologise for that, and probably it shouldn't. That's what the game's aiming for, and that's its strengths, I guess, as a brawler, is the fact that it can challenge people, and then that also encourages people to play it in cooperative, which is the other big feature of this. The Dungeons & Dragons experience was all about getting a group of people together to play a game together. Dragon's Crown is very heavily focused on getting people together to play in cooperative. What you're seeing here is me playing with some AI allies, and as you play through the game you pick up bones which you can use to resurrect AI allies who can then accompany you on missions and help fight the monsters, because otherwise it'd be pretty much impossible to solo most of the game. And the AI is quite good, the AI is quite efficient, and it helps you out when you find that you're in a bit of trouble, but it is still not a replacement for playing with an actual human. And this game really does encourage you to get 3 other people together, so you can form a party of 4, and then go into these dungeons together. Each player will probably have a different character class. There are 6 character classes in Dragon's Crown that you can choose between. I picked the archer here because I am always the archer or the rogue type of character in when I play Dungeons & Dragons, or basically any RPG. But there's also the Amazon, who's a really great fighter. There's the Dwarf, there's Wizard. So there's 6 different character classes. Each one has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. And then the goal is obviously to get 4 people together, each one pick their own favourite character, and then each one perform their own role on the battlefield. The one criticism I might have of the game is that it can get quite manic, and I say that in the context of a preview because everybody's already played the game. I've played the game a lot myself. That's not going to change in time for the reviews. So if you're reading my review in a week or so, that'll probably be the one criticism I have of it. Unless I can think of something else between now and then that I didn't remember being a problem when I played the game the first time, but has come up again when I played it through for review. Not likely. Likely, the only issue I really have with the game is it can become very hard to follow what's going on, especially in those boss battles where the screen fills up with enemies, or the boss itself is absolutely huge, and it can be really hard to follow what your own character is doing. It's not a game that requires absolute precision and accuracy, so you can still kind of button mash your way through if you do lose your character for a moment or two, and that is, it doesn't make the game any harder to progress through, but it is still not ideal, and part of that problem is, of course, because the game uses such huge sprites, and that's because they look so good that the game really wanted to show them off, and that's fair enough. But the consequence to that is, especially when there's 4 characters on the playfield and you're all attacking the one enemy or a small number of enemies, it just becomes very hard to follow along with. It's not game breaking by any means, but in the interest of being adequately critical, I do need to bring it up. And that's basically my full preview of the game. On the screen right now you see me just about to go in and fight the last boss of the second dungeon that I wanted to show you today, and once I do that the video will finish up. But yeah, in summary, I just wanted to again emphasize that obviously this game is very heavily influenced by the Dungeons & Dragons tradition and the pen and paper tradition, and it sounds odd to say that because this is a brawler, it is an action brawler, and it is a very fast-paced game and a very difficult action game. It's not one for people who played the likes of Baldur's Gate, and that was their idea of what a Dungeons & Dragons game should be. But at the same time, the game does a remarkable job of actually staying true to the Dungeons & Dragons experience, which is why, again, I say it's kind of the best example of a Dungeons & Dragons game I've played in quite a few years, because since, basically since Baldur's Gate, Atari's had the license for Dungeons & Dragons, and Atari has mismanaged that franchise so comprehensively, they should probably stop making video games of it, unfortunately. But this game really does it justice without having that license, and it's kind of unfortunate. I would love for Vanillaware to actually get the license to make a proper Dungeons & Dragons game in name as well, because that would be really neat. That would be really, really cool. And I after playing this game, I have every faith that if any developer out there was able to handle it, it would be Vanillaware. This boss battle actually shows you, some of the additional complexities that the boss battles like to throw at you. In this one, in addition to fighting the main enemy there, you have to keep running around to defeat these egg sacs, which otherwise spawn additional things which are not pleasant at all. So the only way to really handle it is to have some of your characters actually target the boss, and then as soon as one of these egg sacs kind of pop up, you need to have at least 1 or 2 characters rush off to deal with it as well, that's the kind of teamwork that you like in action games, and that's something that the likes of Monster Hunter and all those other games have done really well since as well. Having been able to split the party's focus while still making everyone feel like they're fighting a cohesive kind of battle is very difficult to do, and this game, even in this which is only the second boss battle, this game really shows it off. It's the tactics that it enables players to get up to in 4-player and the complexities of it make it really compelling. Again, everybody kind of gets to have their own role, everyone gets to feel like they're participating in the game at every point in time, and it's definitely built around that local co-op experience. So yes, look forward to my review on digitallydownloaded.net in about a week when the review embargo lifts on this game. I'll have a lot more to say then, but hopefully this video has given you a good sense of what the game's about and what to look forward to if you haven't played it before, because I highly recommend it. If you haven't played it before, this is something you should certainly be looking forward to, and make sure you get some friends together because it just gets better the more people you play with. Thanks very much for your time, and we will see you at the next video.
No doubt that the corpse is indeed Lucaine's.